to AI True Crime. Welcome to AI True Crime. The motherboard is humming, a funeral march between the binary cracks and the silicon arch. A ghost in the circuit is
Hollywood has always known how to embalm its dead. It does it with light, with music, with soft focus, with legends polished until the ugliness disappears. A star is turned into a photograph, then a memory, then a myth, and the myth is made to seem cleaner than the life ever was. But sometimes a death is too violent to smooth over, too revealing to contain, and too cruel to fit inside the fantasy machine. By the autumn of 1968, Ramón Novarro was no longer the young idol whose face had once filled theaters and fan magazines. He was 69 years old, living in relative seclusion in Los Angeles, still elegant, still cultivated, still carrying the remnants of a screen image built in the age of silent spectacle. To the public, he was a relic of old Hollywood. To the men who killed him, he was something else entirely, an aging man they believed would be easy to manipulate, easy to rob, and easy to erase. What happened inside Novarro's Laurel Canyon home that night was not a glamorous Hollywood mystery. It was a sadistic home invasion wrapped around loneliness, secrecy, and the toxic bargain queer men were often forced to make in a world that demanded silence from them. The brothers who came to his door were not there to admire a legend. They were there because they thought a forgotten star was hiding money, and because they believed his life, and whatever dignity remained to it, was disposable. And when it was over, the murder did more than end one man's life. It ripped open a truth the industry preferred not to discuss. Ramón Novarro had spent decades surviving in a system that sold him as a romantic fantasy, while denying him the right to live openly as himself. In death, that tension became impossible to ignore. This is AI True Crime. The intelligence is artificial, but the crime is real. Tonight we're talking about the murder of Ramón Novarro. Chapter 1. Before Ramón Novarro became the victim of one of old Hollywood's most brutal murders, he had already lived several lives. Born Ramón Gil Samaniego in 1899 in Durango, Mexico, he entered the American film industry during the silent era and rose into a level of fame that is difficult to overstate today. He was handsome, poised, and intensely photogenic, the kind of star studios could transform into a fantasy with astonishing efficiency. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer helped shape him into a romantic idol, and after Rudolph Valentino's death, Novarro became one of the men expected to carry forward that exoticized, highly marketable image of the Latin lover. This was not a neutral label. Hollywood in the 1920s and early 1930s packaged ethnicity, sexuality, and masculinity into consumable myths, and Novarro fit a very particular one. He was sold as passionate but refined, sensual but aristocratic, foreign enough to seem thrilling, and familiar enough to remain safe for mainstream audiences. His starring role in the 1925 version of Ben-Hur cemented his place in movie history, and other performances, including Scaramouche, the student prince in Old Heidelberg, and later Mata Hari, made him one of the best-known faces in the industry. He was not simply successful for a Mexican-born actor in early Hollywood. He was, by any honest measure, one of the first Latin American stars to truly conquer it. But stardom in that system always came with conditions, and for Novarro, those conditions were severe. He was a gay man working in an industry that depended on illusion, repression, and threat. The studios could invent accents, romances, and public identities, but they could not allow certain truths into public view. According to later accounts, only those close to him knew the extent of his private life, and even then the knowledge existed inside a culture of discretion. The tension was made worse by his Roman Catholicism, which seems to have intensified the conflict between desire, guilt, and self-concealment. What the public saw was elegance and old-world grace. What existed underneath was a life organized around caution. As sound films changed the industry, Novarro's career cooled. That is not unusual in silent film history, but in his case the decline has often overshadowed how substantial his fame once was. He kept working in smaller roles and on television, appearing in projects that reminded audiences he was still alive, still capable, still part of Hollywood, even if no longer at its center. Turner Classic Movies notes that he turned increasingly toward television in later years, taking guest roles on shows like Bonanza, The Wild Wild West, and The High Chaparral. He was financially secure. But security is not the same thing as companionship, and late-life comfort is not the same thing as late-life peace. By 1968, Novarro was living in a quieter world than the one that had made him famous. The parties were gone, the headlines had thinned out, and many of the great names of his era were dead, isolated, or ghosts in their own right. Later reporting in the Los Angeles Times paints a picture of a lonely man, one who could still be gracious, still charming, still capable of creating a mood of warmth and intimacy in his home, but who was also vulnerable in ways celebrity could no longer protect. The machinery of stardom had once made him larger than life. Age, secrecy, and solitude had made him painfully reachable. That vulnerability mattered because it shaped the conditions of the crime. The Ferguson brothers did not randomly select a stranger. They got Novarro's phone number through someone who had been in his orbit before, and they understood the coded economy operating around him. They knew, or thought they knew, the sort of invitation they might receive. They also believed a rumor that he kept thousands of dollars hidden inside the house. That rumor was false, but it became the engine of everything that followed. A faded legend, a private appetite, a false promise of easy money, and two men willing to turn all of that into torture. The old Hollywood tragedy at the center of this story begins there, not with a glamorous mystery, but with predators deciding that a man's loneliness made him usable. Chapter 2. Old Hollywood liked to pretend its stars lived above ordinary danger. The mansions, the gates, the portraits, the polished silver, and the carefully managed columns in fan magazines all created the same illusion, that fame could become a kind of magic circle, a bright ring drawn around the chosen. Ramón Novarro had once stood inside that ring. By 1968, the spell had thinned. He was still living in a beautiful house in Laurel Canyon, still surrounded by the relics of a life in pictures, but the glamour that had once made him seem untouchable had become something more fragile, almost theatrical, like scenery left standing after the crew has gone home. Later accounts make clear that he was no longer a reigning star, but a solitary older man whose name still carried power with the wrong kind of people. On October 30th, 1968, that illusion failed completely. Paul and Tom Ferguson, brothers aged 22 and 17, got into Novarro's house after contacting him and offering sexual services. Reporting and later summaries agree on the central fact that they came not simply for sex, but for money, convinced by rumor that the former movie idol had a large cache of cash hidden somewhere inside the house. The rumor was false, but once they were inside, falsehood became motive. They began searching, then demanding, then brutalizing him when the imagined fortune did not appear. What entered that house was not temptation, not scandal, not the salacious little morality play later gossip tried to turn it into. It was greed sharpened by contempt. The details remain hideous even now. Prosecutors said the brothers tortured Novarro for hours while trying to force him to reveal where the non-existent money was hidden. Accounts of the scene describe a home ransacked in a frenzy, the body badly beaten, and a death that came not from one clean blow, but from accumulated violence. The autopsy findings later cited in reliable retellings reported multiple traumatic injuries, including severe injuries to the face, neck, nose, and mouth. He died of asphyxiation after choking on his own blood. For all the cruelty inflicted on him, the killers left with only about $20 from his bathrobe pocket, a fact so bleak and absurd that it almost feels written to expose the emptiness of the entire crime. A screen legend was tortured to death for the price of a cheap night out. This is where the story begins to slide into something almost mythic, because Hollywood itself has always behaved like a machine for producing myths out of suffering. A handsome young man arrives from elsewhere, is renamed, reframed, and lifted into stardom. He becomes a prince, a lover, a hero in jeweled costumes, his face enormous against the dark. Then the years pass, the world changes, the crowds move on, and he remains in a canyon house like some fallen figure from a silent epic, still adorned with the symbols of old beauty, while the world around him grows meaner and less enchanted. When death comes, it does not come like tragedy in the movies. It comes like invasion. That is not literally what happened, but it is the shape the case still takes in memory. It feels less like the end of a celebrity and more like the slaughter of a forgotten king. The facts support the crime. The atmosphere around it made the legend. There was another cruelty layered over the murder, almost immediately. Because Novarro was gay, and because so much of his life had been spent under the pressure of secrecy, the case was treated by many not simply as a murder, but as a revelation, almost as an exposure. Instead of meeting his death with the dignity usually granted dead stars, parts of the press and public read it through the ugliest possible lens, as if the circumstances of how the killers entered his home somehow diluted what had been done to him. Later writers have pointed out how thoroughly homophobia shaped the response, turning sympathy into judgment and allowing victim blaming to creep into the coverage and the cultural memory. In that sense, the murder did not end with his body. It kept happening in language, in implication, and in the suggestion that a private life forced into shadows could somehow excuse monstrous violence. Stripped of gossip, stripped of moralism and the old studio haze, the truth is simpler and uglier. Ramón Novarro was an elderly man alone in his home. Two younger men entered that home, thinking he had money, tortured him when they could not find it, and left him dying on his own blood. That is the crime. The myth grows because Hollywood can't help itself. It turns every death into narrative, every room into a set, every victim into a symbol. Yet beneath the symbol remains the human being, and in this case the human being was not just a star of the silence, but the first Latin American successes in American film. A man who survived reinvention, prejudice, and decades of concealment, only to die in one of the most degrading crimes ever attached to old Hollywood's name. Chapter 3. The discovery of the crime had none of the grandeur that old Hollywood liked in its tragedies. There was only a house in Laurel Canyon that had gone suddenly, horribly still. The rooms had been torn apart. The search for money that did not exist had left its mark everywhere. Whatever fantasies the Ferguson brothers carried into the house dissolved the moment police began reconstructing the scene. Because the evidence did not suggest a crime of panic. It suggested prolonged violence, frenzy, humiliation, and indifference to whether Novarro lived or died. In that sense, the investigation stripped away the lurid gossip almost at once. Beneath the whispers was a truth. A famous man had been tortured in his own home by people who thought his age and his reputation made him easy prey. The brothers did not turn out to be criminal masterminds, and that is part of what gives the case its especially ugly texture. Paul Ferguson was 22, Tom Ferguson was 17. They had come hunting for cash because they believed there was a fortune hidden in the house. Instead of finding treasure, they found only the ordinary contents of an aging man's life. And when the house failed to produce the myth, they created a new one. By the time investigators closed in on them, the shape of the crime was already clear. This was not a mystery in the classic mystery where a dozen elegant suspects orbit a pool of secrets. It was a home invasion powered by greed and the casual brutality of two young men who thought they could terrorize a lonely older star into producing money that wasn't there. The gap between what they imagined and what they took, about $20 from a bathrobe pocket, remains one of the most pitiful details. Once the case moved toward court, a transformation began. The murder itself was brutal, but the story of the murder became warped in a different way. The legal case focused on robbery, torture, and homicide. The culture kept trying to turn it into a morality play about sex, secrecy, and the supposed decadence of old Hollywood. That distortion mattered because it changed how people remembered Novarro. Instead of being seen first as a victim of a vicious crime, he was too often treated as if his private life somehow explained what had been done to him. The trial therefore unfolded on two levels at once. In one arena, prosecutors laid out the mechanics of the killing and the brothers' belief in hidden money. In the other, the press and the public kept circling the fact that Novarro was a gay man whose life had been lived under decades of caution and disguise. Hollywood, which had once profited from inventing him, now seemed almost eager to consume him one last time, as scandal if not as star. That is one reason the case still feels so haunted, but the ugliness of the reaction around it. The convictions came, and with them the sort of formal ending that true crime often pretends is enough. The Ferguson brothers were convicted of first-degree murder in 1969 and received prison sentences, which on paper should have closed the story, but the case refused to stay closed in any emotional or cultural sense. Part of that is because the punishment itself never seemed proportionate to the horror of the crime. Both men were eventually released on parole in the mid-70s, and both later returned to prison for unrelated crimes, serving longer stretches for those later offenses than for the killing of Ramón Novarro. Facts like that do not just disturb people. They change the tone of a case. They make it feel less like justice imperfectly achieved, and more like one more desecration, one more insult added after the blood has dried. In later years, Paul Ferguson reportedly claimed responsibility for the fatal blows, which gave the story yet another aftershock, another belated shiver of acknowledgement long after the man at the center of it had been dead for decades. That is where the case deepens into myth, because Hollywood is one of the few places on Earth where a murder can become both history and ghost story. Ramón Novarro had once been manufactured into a dream of beauty, longing, and aristocratic romance. By the end, he had become something sadder and stranger, a warning about what happens when a culture demands that someone remain desirable, but never fully human, visible, but never knowable, adored, but never safely loved. His murder remains shocking because of its savagery, but it lingers because it feels like the last act of an older curse. Silent Hollywood made gods, but it made them out of flesh, and flesh ages and bleeds. When the brothers entered that canyon house, they were not literally killing a prince from a lost empire of shadows and nitrate film. The murder of Ramón Novarro endures, not just because a star died horribly, but because an entire mythology of glamour failed to protect one of its own when the dark finally came to the door. Chapter 4. If the story had ended with the trial, Ramón Novarro might still be remembered first as what he was, the victim of a brutal robbery and murder, and before that, one of silent Hollywood's great stars. But Hollywood rarely leaves the dead in peace. It rewrites them through rumor, scandal, and repetition until tragedy becomes spectacle. After Novarro's death, the facts of the crime were steadily blurred by gossip columns, scandal histories, and industry whispers. The murder remained real, but it was surrounded by embellishment, innuendo, and cruelty, as if the culture could not bear to let him die only once. That is part of why his name still carries such a strange weight. To some, he remains the beautiful star of silent epics, a face from the age of vast sets and shadowy glamour. To others, he is remembered mainly for the violence of his death. That imbalance is one of the saddest parts of the case. In public memory, the murder grew larger than the life, swallowing his artistry, his cultural importance, and the remarkable fact that a Mexican-born actor reached such heights in early American film. A man once seen as one of the screen's great romantic figures was reduced, in too many retellings, to the details of how he died. That is the final theft. The killers took his future, and the culture tried to take his past. Some of this came from outright invention. The most notorious falsehood was the claim that the murder involved an obscene weapon linked to Rudolph Valentino. It endured because it was exactly the sort of toxic story Hollywood scandal culture loves: sexual, theatrical, decadent, and cruel. But it was false. Like many legends attached to famous deaths, it survived not because it was true, but because it satisfied an appetite for rotten glamour. The truth was already terrible. It needed no embellishment. Yet people preferred the salacious lie to the bleak reality of an aging man beaten to death by two men looking for money that was not there. And yet the older, more meaningful myth remains. Novarro belongs to a generation of stars who now seem half human and half apparition, figures from an industry so distant it can feel more like folklore than history. Their faces survive in still photographs and flickering prints. Their voices often do not. They look back at us from a vanished world of nitrate film, studio contracts, gossip columnists, church pressures, and impossible public masks. Novarro's life fits that world perfectly, and his death feels like its nightmare ending. A beautiful man shaped by the dream factory, forced to live carefully within it, then left exposed when age, loneliness, and secrecy made him vulnerable. In that sense, the case becomes more than a murder story. It becomes one of old Hollywood's last true Gothic tales, where splendor curdles into isolation and myth collapses in a canyon house at night. What keeps the story alive is not just its atmosphere, but what it reveals about the system that made him famous. Novarro was desired, but never allowed to be fully known. He was marketable, but not free. He was elevated, but trapped inside an image built for other people's fantasies. That tension did not begin with the Ferguson brothers, and it did not end with the verdict. It was built into old Hollywood itself. Later writers who returned to the case understood that the murder could not be separated from the world around it. The pressure placed on queer stars, the contempt aimed at gay men, and the willingness to treat violence against them as sordid inevitability rather than atrocity. To remember Novarro honestly means rejecting that logic. It means seeing him not as a scandal or cautionary tale, but as a person whose life mattered beyond the manner of his death. So the final image should not be the ransacked house, the courtroom, or the tabloid whisper. It should be closer to what Hollywood once promised him before it failed him. A face lit against darkness. A performer carrying longing and grandeur across the silent screen. A man who made himself unforgettable, even in a culture eager to flatten him into type. The murder of Ramón Novarro is a true crime story, but it is also a story about memory and survival. The killers are remembered because they were monstrous. Novarro should be remembered because he was luminous. The tragedy is that history so often confuses the two. The task of looking back is to separate them again. Chapter 5. In the end, cases like this force a question that true crime does not always like to ask. What do we owe the dead once the sensational part is over? Not what do we owe the audience, or the story, or the mood, or the clean structure of a narrative that moves from life to crime to punishment. What do we owe the actual person who was there before any of it became content, before any of it became legend, before strangers began repeating the ugliest parts of his last night as though repetition itself were understanding? Ramón Novarro entered history twice, first as a star, then as a victim. The second entry swallowed the first for a very long time. That is one of the bleakest things about Hollywood, and maybe one of the truest. It promises immortality, but it rarely grants wholeness. It preserves faces, not always lives. It remembers beauty, but often forgets context. It can build a man into an icon, and then leave him defenseless inside the icon's shell. Novarro had once been a prince of the silent screen, one of those figures who seemed made to inhabit a world larger and more elegant than ordinary life. But no glamour, no body of work, no old fame, no carefully guarded dignity could keep cruelty from crossing his threshold. When the moment came, he was not protected by the machine that had once enlarged him. He was simply a human being alone in a house, facing men who saw him as vulnerable and disposable. And yet even that is not the whole story, because if the murder reduced him, memory does not have to. We can choose what kind of shape the story takes when we tell it now. We can make him only a cautionary tale about loneliness, secrecy, and predation. We can make him only a gruesome anecdote from the dark edges of old Hollywood. Or we can do something harder and better. We can insist that the crime belongs to the story of his life, but does not define the entire meaning of it. We can remember that before there was a body in a Laurel Canyon house, there was a performer whose image helped define an era, a Mexican-born actor who conquered one of the most exclusionary industries in the world, and a man who carried beauty and sorrow on screen in a way people still respond to nearly a century later. Maybe that is why the case still lingers so powerfully, not just because it was brutal, though it was, not just because it exposed the ugliness under Hollywood's painted surface, though it certainly did that too. It lingers because it feels like an argument over what survives. The killers survive in the record because of what they destroyed. Novarro survives because something in him outlasted destruction. The old photographs still exist, the films still flicker, the face still emerges from the dark. Time did not save him, but it did not erase him either. In a world that often remembers violence more easily than grace, choosing to look back at grace is its own act of resistance. So when we close the file on the murder of Ramón Novarro, we should close it carefully, not with the easy satisfaction of a solved case, because there is nothing satisfying here. Not with the ghoulish thrill that scandal culture always tries to sell, and not even only with pity. We should close it with clarity. He was a victim of a vicious crime. He was also a major star, a complicated man, a figure shaped and wounded by his time, and someone whose life deserves more than footnote status beneath the details of his death. True crime, at its best, is supposed to restore proportion where violence has shattered it. In this case, proportion means refusing to let the murder eclipse the man. This has been AI true crime. The intelligence is artificial, but the crime is real, and in the case of Ramón Novarro, the real story is not only that Hollywood produced a nightmare, it is that long before the nightmare, it produced someone unforgettable. Next time, we start out look at one of the darkest crime sprees in American history, the murder spree of Carol Ann Fugate and Charlie Starkweather.
Welcome to AI True Crime. Welcome to AI True Crime. The motherboard is humming, a funeral march between the binary cracks and the silicon arch. A ghost in the circuit is rewriting the past, tracing a shadow that was never meant to last. The pixelated blood on the cold concrete screen tells a story of a logic that remains unseen, a sequence of errors in a heart made of gold. The darkest of data begins to unfold. The algorithm found a crack in the door, scanning the wreckage spread out on the floor. The solver is hungry for secrets and lies, reflecting the static in mechanical eyes. a synthetic blend.